Hello, I'm Sarah Coates and you're watching I24 News. We begin with news just in. A short while ago, and US President Donald Trump has announced that the United States should recognise the Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, an area which was taken from Syria back in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Trump tweeting, after 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognise Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, adding that the territory is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is currently here in Israel, is thanking the president, calling the move bold. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking at a joint press conference with Pompeo, with Netanyahu saying that the announcement is a Purim miracle, adding that Donald Trump has made history.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. Embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty and reimposed sanctions. But now he did something of equal historic importance. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel. President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that, an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic, and the people of Israel should know that the battles they fought, the lives that they lost on that very ground, were worthy and meaningful and important for all time.
Let's go now to DC, to our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. Hello, Dan. Thanks for being with us. Firstly, can you clarify when President Trump tweeted that it's time to recognise Israeli sovereignty? Is that the same as a formal decision by the US government?
Well, best we can tell, Sarah, no formal steps are actually required. It's up to the president as chief executive and head of state of the United States to make declarations like this. You got to keep in mind the U.S. recognized the state of Israel when it was created in May of 1948. The U.S. recognizes Israel. The U.S. doesn't decide what the borders are, but still, there are some technical steps. For instance, after the Six-Day War of 1967, U.S. diplomats and officials were told that they can't go to the Golan Heights that have been captured from Syria, or the West Bank captured from Jordan, or even to East Jerusalem, at least for quite a few years, because those were not part of Israel. Clearly, the instructions from the White House and then from the State Department will change. Those are just technical steps. You can take it as a given that President Trump has decided the U.S. recognizes that the Golan is now part of Israel. Sarah.
And Dan, what do you make of the timing of this decision by Donald Trump? He's going to be meeting Benjamin Netanyahu next week in Washington, so why not make that announcement then?
Right. That would seem almost natural, Monday or Tuesday, when the two leaders are together, that President Trump could do something so friendly toward Israel and Netanyahu. We don't know exactly why, except note that Secretary of State Pompeo is in Israel at this time. There is the possibility that as Pompeo met with Netanyahu, that Pompeo would be on the phone to President Trump, and in effect they'd say, what can we do to show our support for Netanyahu? Yes, even during the Israeli election campaign. And it's quite likely that the U.S. side said he probably would like it if we'd recognize the Golan Heights at this time. It's all up to President Trump, who announced it his way on Twitter. Sarah?
And Dan, is there any reaction there yet in Washington? Just before the big AIPAC conference, we've already seen political divisions when it comes to support for Israel. So what will this Golan Heights decision do?
that could add to the divisions here in the United States. In recent weeks already, there have been some in the Democratic Party who have made it well known that they are not big supporters of Israel, and they don't like Israeli policies, and they don't like Netanyahu. So what will they think of this, right? Already, a group called Americans for Peace Now, associated with the Peace Now movement in Israel, put out a statement that holding the Golan Heights is a violation of international law, and President Trump should not have done this to help his pal Netanyahu. There could be some in the Democratic Party who say that kind of thing heading into the AIPAC conference that starts on Sunday. But the Republican Party under Trump, they will be 100% in support of what Trump did, as well as in support of Netanyahu, who will be at AIPAC this coming Sunday. Sarah.
OK, Dan Raviv in Washington, thank you for breaking that down. Let's now go to our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, who joins me here in the studio. Owen, thank you. We've heard from Netanyahu calling this announcement a Purim miracle, rather. So what else, what other reactions are we hearing coming out of Israel?
Well, listen, Sarah, Israeli politicians are thrilled, as you would expect, really praising the decision. Again, I'm sure they're thrilled about the decision. I'm not sure they're so thrilled about what it means for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who many of them are running against in the elections coming up on April 9th. But obviously the politician's quite happy. You can expect that large segments of the public here will be very happy. I will say at the margins, you're hearing some talk of some people who see this a little bit differently. Why? Because at the end of the day, Israel's not under pressure because of its presence in the Golan Heights. Israel's under pressure because of a whole lot of other things that Israel does, but not because of this issue in particular. This initiative by the U.S. government, and to some extent by the Netanyahu government as well, has started to give more attention on Israel's activities in the Golan Heights and Israel's presence in the Golan Heights, and started to wake up those sleeping dogs. And now potentially we'll see a resolution at the United Nations condemning this move. And again, it just focuses attention on an issue which de facto, maybe not de jure, maybe not officially, but in practice, had been settled. There wasn't pressure on Israel to withdraw from the Golan or make moves on the Golan. But now maybe there will be as a kind of counter-reaction to this decision. Again, this is one argument you're hearing that's at the margins of the discussion. Obviously, the mainstream view, the view among the politicians, and one can assume the view among huge swaths of the public here, that people will be thrilled about this, and there's no question that it will help Prime Minister Netanyahu come April 9th.
Certainly. And Owen, tell us, how is the rest of the world going to see this?
Not well. Listen, the Russians are already coming out against this. Although I will say in parentheses, I think there are things about this for the Russians to like in a way, but they certainly aren't going to say that. They'll come out against it. Again, helps build their soft power internationally, and I expect we'll hear other countries have similar reactions. The Europeans today have their hands full with Brexit. The leaders are meeting in a summit in Brussels, and they're fully focused on that issue. But when they come up for air, I'm sure we'll hear the European Union and many European leaders come out against this, as well as other countries like China and, of course, countries in the Arab world. And, of course, tomorrow is a Friday with Friday prayers, and, again, will be interesting to see what kind of reaction we start to get from across the Muslim world, and certainly from Syria as well. Yeah,
it certainly will be. Owen Alterman, thank you for that. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has made an unprecedented visit to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, joined by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the US Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. It's the first time a US diplomat has paid a visit to the contested Old City with an Israeli official, with many now saying that the move signals recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish holy site.
The person of faith, it's always inspiring to drive through the winding streets of the Old City. We had a chance to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then the incredible privilege to visit the Western Wall with the Prime Minister of Israel as the American Secretary of State was truly moving, important, and I think indicative of the remarkable relationship between our two countries.
Let's go now to Gaza, where just a short while ago, an Israeli Defense Forces tank shelled a Hamas outpost south of the Gaza Strip, with an IDF spokesperson coming out to say that the shelling is in response to intense clashes on the border with Israel, as well as the continued launching of incendiary balloons. And we will, of course, bring you more information on this developing story as it becomes available. But we are taking a short break now. Stay with us. Plenty more after this.
lead with tonight? Iran, China, Russia, D.C.?
How about North Korea?
Well, on Crossroads, we usually cover them all. I'm Tal Heinrich.
And I'm David Schuster. Join us each night for hard-hitting interviews, detailed analysis,
and the most important information you need to know.
It's the largest American Jewish conference, featuring leaders, decision-makers, movers and shakers from the U.S. and Israel. 2 days of intense discussions, a time to debate the policy and cement the Israeli-U.S. alliance. And this year, Israel's top 2 candidates for prime minister will be there, joined by other leading Israeli politicians, moving the focus on intense election campaign from Israel to the U.S. And I-24 News will be there to bring you live coverage. The annual AIPAC conference, March 24th to March 26th, only on I-24 News.
The Middle East. I-24 News is a witness. Our journalists live and breathe there every day. Get all the latest global news from our studios in Tel Aviv, New York, Washington, and Paris. Anytime, anywhere. Download the I-24 News app, available on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple, and Google stores. I-24 News, see beyond.
Thanks for staying with us. Let's go back now to US President Donald Trump's announcement that the United States should recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, an area which was taken from Syria back in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Now, this is US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is here in Israel today, making an unprecedented visit to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, joined by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the US Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. It's the first time a US diplomat has paid a visit to the contested Old City with an Israeli official. Let's go now to Jerusalem to our correspondent Asher Westrop-Evans, who is standing by. Asher, thank you. We heard from Pompeo and from Benjamin Netanyahu a short while ago regarding US President Donald Trump's tweet over the Golan Heights. Tell us what reaction are you hearing to that there?
Well, Sarah, we just had a day go from symbolic to historic. Certainly with Donald Trump's tweet, he managed to change the entire tone of the conversation, and that could be felt throughout the speeches made by the two men. That's Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who spoke shortly after the tweet was made here behind me at the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. Both men speaking of the significance and the historic nature of the decision made by U.S. President Donald Trump, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu labeling it a Purim miracle.
And Asher, we also saw the pair visit the Western Wall in Jerusalem just a few hours ago, an unprecedented move there. Tell us, why was this visit so significant?
Well, certainly, Sarah, not to be overshadowed, Mike Pompeo's visit to the Western Wall, the highest-ranking U.S. official to ever go to the Western Wall, accompanied by an Israeli official, in this case, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, accompanying him to the Western Wall. Normally, when foreign dignitaries and officials go to visit the Western Wall, they do so in what's known as a private capacity, doing so for religious or personal reverence reasons, but trying to move away from the politics of the situation. In this case, the politics being wholeheartedly embraced with that significant moment of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mike Pompeo standing next to each other with their hands placed on the wall, both sort of signifying the importance of the Old City claim, which is a disputed territory still between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
OK, Asher Westrop-Evans in Jerusalem, thank you for the update. An investigation has been opened into the killing of 26-year-old Palestinian man Ahmed Jamal Mahmoud, who was shot dead by Israeli forces just outside Bethlehem overnight. Hundreds of mourners marking his death in the West Bank village of Wadi Fukan today after an Israeli soldier fired shots at his vehicle after rocks were allegedly thrown at cars outside Bethlehem. The IDF has released a statement saying Mahmoud's death will be looked into with an investigation by the military police opened. The leader of Israel's newly formed Blue and White Party, Benny Gantz, is accusing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of neglecting Israelis. In a press conference just a couple of hours ago, Gantz slammed the government's policies on transport and healthcare, adding that Israel needs to invest in youth, calling for free childcare for working parents.
We're not wedded to grand announcements. We're wedded to great changes. And it seems to me that what's important is that the daily life of citizens will improve. We're ready to push for this for all citizens. Macro data can be as good as you want. The true test is that of the citizen.
At least 72 people are dead and many more are missing, with a ferry sinking today in northern Iraq. Officials say the tragedy is due to the vessel being overcrowded by more than 100 people, with families on board celebrating the Kurdish New Year. Now, they were on their way to a popular picnic area when the ship took on water in a swollen river in Mosul. It's understood authorities had previously warned the public to be careful after heavy rain forced water to be released from a dam, making the river level rise. Moving now to Brexit, and EU leaders are in Brussels for a summit as they consider an extension for Brexit proposed by British Prime Minister Theresa May. 28 heads of government are expected to grant her 2 more months to organise Britain's exit from the EU, with May needing to win over British lawmakers to back her withdrawal agreement. She's requested an extension of June 30, a short delay to Britain's departure from the European Union, which would give Parliament time to make a final choice on Brexit.
I'm here today to discuss with fellow leaders our request for a short extension of Article 50 to the end of June. As I said yesterday, this delay is a matter of personal regret to me, but a short extension would give Parliament the time to make a final choice that delivers on the result of the referendum. But we must also not forget that we're here as leaders of 28 countries discussing the global challenges that we face. And I've always said that although we're leaving the European Union, of course we will continue to have shared interests. Notably among those are shared security and prosperity.
Meanwhile, in a sign of support for Israel, the UK is reiterating its pledge to oppose anti-Israel resolutions at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt says that the Council spends a disproportionate amount of time discussing rights abuses in the West Bank and Gaza, which puts a discriminatory focus on Israel and obstructs efforts for peace in the Middle East. There's a serious and troubling trend in the United States which appears to be spreading. Authorities are reporting that hate groups are popping up at an historic rate. The Southern Poverty Law Centre designated more than 1,000 organisations as hate groups in 2018. That's the highest in at least 2 decades, and even the reporting is controversial. Our senior US correspondent Michael Shaw reports.
The rise of hate groups in the United States has been alarming even to those who monitor them.
Pittsburgh is connected to Wisconsin, is connected to Oslo, is connected to Christchurch.
Shahad Al-Manula studies online extremism and sees an American problem.
I don't think the average American can name kind of some of the more prominent white nationalist groups in this country. And as long as they are under the radar, they're going to be feeling pretty cocky and confident about what they do.
In name and action, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 showed that this confidence is also above the radar.
During Trump's candidacy and presidency, we've documented a rise of about 30% in the number of organized hate groups in our country.
Richard Cohen is the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. Since 1990, the SPLC has released an annual census of hate groups in the United States.
At the same time that we see hate groups go up, we're seeing hate crimes go up. So I think we're detecting something that's very real.
Even in the face of statistics, not everyone agrees that the SPLC should be the arbiter of what defines a hate group.
The only organization in America that is labeling people and individuals as either hate groups or hate mongers is the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin is vice president of the Family Research Council. The SPLC labels them a hate group and Boykin an extremist.
Who gave them the authority to label anybody or any organization as a hate group? And the answer is they did. They appointed themselves. Okay, so what's their criteria?
We identify hate groups as those that vilify other people for characteristics such as race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation.
Cohen says that this definition supports Boykin's group being on the list.
The Family Research Council, a group that we list as a hate group because of its constant vilification of the LGBT community.
But General Boykin feels that his group is unfairly singled out.
We're on a hate list because we have defined marriage in a biblical context.
But the reality is that the LGBT community in our country is the most likely to be victimized by hate crimes, particularly vicious ones. And so if you have an organization that is constantly vilifying, the LGBT community, we think it merits the hate group label.
Boykin questions this.
How about the groups that are advocating violence that are not on their list?
Shahad Al-Manullah says that even if not violent, rhetoric can provoke.
You can claim all you want that you're nonviolent, but people who are violent are inspired by you. And that means you have to be held to some account to that.
The Family Research Council is not going to appeal their designation.
We're not going to go and ask them to take us off that list, because it's an illegitimate list to begin with.
Look, our hate group listing is just one barometer of the level of vitriol in our country.
According to Richard Cohen, it's a barometer on the rise.
Now, as Donald Trump waits on the release of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into possible collusion in the 2016 presidential election, it's just come out that the top Department of Justice officials intend to notify the media and Congress as soon as that report has been delivered to Attorney General William Barr. At that time, Barr expects to state that he and other senior officials will take a few days to read the report and decide what can be released to Congress while being mindful of grand jury secrecy provisions and matters involving classified US national intelligence. US President Trump is continuing his relentless and bizarre attacks on late Senator John McCain, a longtime political rival, but a man who's been dead for almost 8 months. Jonathan Karl has a reaction from McCain's family.
Standing before a line of tanks at a factory in Lima, Ohio, President Trump launched an all-out assault on late Senator and war hero John McCain.
So I have to be honest, I've never liked him much. Hasn't been for me. I've really probably never will.
The pro-military crowd silent as Trump told them he never got a thank you for authorizing the use of an Air Force jet to transfer McCain's casket along with other military support for his memorial service.
I gave him the kind of funeral that he wanted, which as president I had to approve. I don't care about this. I didn't get thank you. That's okay. We sent him on the way, but I wasn't a fan of John McCain. So now what we could say is, now we're all set. I don't think I have to answer that question, but the press keeps, what do you think of McCain? What do you think? Not my kind of guy, but some people like him, and I think that's great.
The president started his renewed attacks on McCain over the weekend, and today McCain's widow, Cindy, revealed one of the hateful messages she's received in recent days. On The View today, McCain's daughter, Megan, called the president's attacks a bizarre new low.
If I had told my dad, 7 months after you're dead, you're going to be dominating the news and all over Twitter, he would think it was hilarious that our president was so jealous of him that he was dominating the news cycle in death as well.
Most Republican senators have resisted directly criticizing the president for his attacks on McCain. But today, Georgia Republican Johnny Isaacson, who chairs the Veterans Affairs Committee, said enough is enough.
It's deplorable what he said. We should never reduce the service that people give to this country.
An arrest warrant has been issued for the former president of Brazil, Michel Temer, who's being investigated in a number of corruption cases. A judge in Rio de Janeiro putting out the order as part of an ongoing corruption probe involving kickbacks to politicians and public officials. The probe is commonly known as the car wash investigation, which has seen wealthy businessmen and politicians jailed, including ex-president Inácio Lula da Silva. Israeli elections can certainly be an overwhelming experience, even for lifelong residents of the country. It's even more confusing and complicated for new immigrants who'll be voting for the first time. That's why one organisation put together a special seminar. Our diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim went to class, Politics 101.
Try not to be kind of scared or overwhelmed by what's on the screen. I'm going to explain it all.
Yes, Israeli politics can indeed be scary for new immigrants and exchange students like these. That's why the Menachem Begin Heritage Center put together this Israeli Politics 101 course.
There's an understanding, I think, that Israeli politics is confusing enough for Israelis, let alone people that are moving here from various countries in the world. And I wanted to offer them some opportunity to understand a little more about the issues at stake in the election, about the parties, even the system, which is very confusing for people that are coming from a different country.
The class laid out, in layman's terms, the Israeli political system. In attendance at the class were natives of America, Canada, the UK, and Germany, allowing for teacher and students to draw from certain points of reference amongst their varied but well-known political systems, with limits.
Okay, anywhere that isn't Europe or North America. Where from, sir?
Singapore.
Ah, okay, completely different. I'm not going to relate to it or try to or pretend that I know anything about it. It's really great when you see Olim Chadashim, new immigrants, getting involved in different political parties, volunteering. Even, we see Olim standing for Knesset. So it shows that we're really sort of fitting in to the Israeli crazy system.
So, what were the takeaways for these newbies?
I think I'm going to have a closer look at the smaller parties because they kind of come into a coalition and they can really affect the government.
Well, I didn't know. It surprised me that the prime minister can be there forever. He can be, we don't have that. We just can be 8 years. So it surprised me.
I think more than what I learned, I think it's important to become involved, to participate in these kind of lectures, to have a better understanding of what's the political situation, what the parties have to offer, and to make the best decision when we go to vote in April 9th.
School's out for now. The final exam is on Election Day. For I-24 News, Mike Wagenheim, Jerusalem.
We want to focus on
And we are waiting for US President Donald Trump to speak shortly in Washington. And we will, of course, go live to that when it happens. Israel's Bereshit rocket is still hurtling through space on the way to the moon, but Israeli scientists already have their sights set on the next destination, something much further away, Mars. More in the next report.
One small step for man, one giant leap for the Jewish people.
This mission was a simulation of human settlement on Mars.
6 amateur astronauts, 11 days in Israel's rocky Ramon crater.
Going out for the first time in a full spacesuit, hearing the flow of air through the system with the comms, nobody else around here. The thought does go through your mind, where am I right now?
The mission? To prepare mankind for a human landing on Mars, running microbiological experiments here in the desert, learning what bacteria humans could bring to Mars and what they might bring home.
The surface is very similar to the surface of Mars.
It's dry and the weather is kind of similar to Mars.
The team also ran psychological experiments on themselves, and everyone said the biggest challenge was the intense isolation.
The purpose of this mission was to better understand how small teams work in an isolated place.
The human dynamic the human factor is the main challenge in any long space mission of a year or two.
We had very limited communication with our families and with the mission control. And there is a delay of about 10 minutes from the moment you send the message till it's received.
It's a project by DMARS, a space simulation center working closely with the Israeli Space Agency and conducting experiments for scientists all over the world, living as closely as possible to life on the red planet, sleeping in this cramped habitat powered by solar panels.
Oxygen is the most important thing, water, food. We have to grow vegetables on the habitat.
We showered very little with very little water, and we ate mostly dried food that you warm up.
And the astronauts here have high hopes to visit Earth's nearest neighbor.
Human settlement on Mars is not science fiction. It's absolutely realistic.
I'm sure that the next Israeli astronaut that goes to the space station or to Mars is going to start out here. Humanity is going to travel to Mars in the next decades.
Israel's Bereshit rocket is still en route to the moon. Will the next destination for Israeli science be planet Mars? Elon Levy, I24 News.
And we are seeing live images coming in now from Washington, with journalists standing by waiting for US President Donald Trump to speak. And of course, we will take that live when it happens. But for now, let's go to some other news. Just in a short while ago, and US President Donald Trump has announced that the United States should recognise Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights, an area which was taken from Syria back in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Trump tweeting, after 52 years, it's time for the United States to fully recognise Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, adding that the territory is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and to regional stability. And for more on this story, I'm joined here in the studio by our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman. Owen, tell us, what do you make of the timing of this? We know that the Israeli Prime Minister will be in Washington next week, so why didn't Trump just make this announcement then?
Well, Sarah, the general timing, one would think, is connected to the upcoming Israeli elections on April 9th, but of course your question is different. Why now and why not next week when Prime Minister Netanyahu will be at the White House with President Trump? Listen, at this point, I think we're just guessing. Again, the timing of this announcement really took so many of us by surprise. One possibility, this creates two headlines. The headline today of the announcement, again with Mike Pompeo in town, and then the headline next week when Benjamin Netanyahu gets to congratulate Donald Trump in person in front of the cameras for this decision, again creating for Donald Trump another headline, and of course creating for Benjamin Netanyahu a second headline. Another possibility, Dan Raviv talked about this, our senior Washington correspondent, just a few moments ago, talking about the fact that this might have been also intentionally meant to help Benjamin Netanyahu. And if that were the case, Dan speculated, it might have even been coordinated with the prime minister, in some sense even asking the prime minister what he wants and what the administration could deliver. If that's the case, the next step would be that maybe Benjamin Netanyahu had a say in this timing, and maybe it was designed to be able to dominate a news cycle when there have been charges in the last couple of days surrounding one of the corruption cases in which Benjamin Netanyahu, we should say, has not been a suspect, but from some new discoveries and some new allegations, maybe it's possible that this was a way of Prime Minister Netanyahu to be able to get this off of the front pages and out of the headlines of the newscasts. But again, Sarah, at the end of the day, this is really anyone's guess. And over the medium and long term, more important than the timing here will be the substance. And this really is a dramatic step by the United States with implications far beyond the Golan.
It really is, Owen. And tell us, how much of a boost do you believe this will give Netanyahu here in the elections, which, of course, are on April 9 here in Israel?
A significant boost. Again, Sarah, go back to the announcement that elections are going to be called. Benjamin Netanyahu sat in that room at the Knesset, gave the first speech of his election campaign right as the elections were about to be called. What was the first thing he talked about in that speech? What was the first thing he wanted to say to the Israeli public? My record in raising Israel's diplomatic profile, my record in building relationships with Israel, with other countries around the world, and none, of course, is more important than the United States and the personal relationship he has with Donald Trump. Sarah, you may have seen them, just as I've seen them, those billboards all over Israel with Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump plastered on skyscrapers and towers. Again, this is an official campaign poster by the Likud, by Prime Minister Netanyahu's party, again, putting him up there next to Donald Trump, putting that relationship, the relationship between the two countries, the personal relationship between the two leaders, the relationship that Benjamin Netanyahu says that he has helped to forge and has helped to build as a centerpiece of his election campaign, so being able to put this front and center, not only next week in Washington, but today here in Israel, certainly serves Netanyahu's interests, and he seems to feel will really help him in the election. There's every reason to believe that it will.
Okay, Owen, stay with me. And meanwhile, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who's currently here in Israel, is thanking the president, calling the move bold. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking at a joint press conference with Pompeo, with Netanyahu saying that the announcement is a Purim miracle, adding that Donald Trump has made history.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty and reimposed sanctions. But now he did something of equal historic importance. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel. President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic, and the people of Israel should know that the battles they fought, the lives that they lost on that very ground, were worthy and meaningful and important for all time.
And that was, of course, Mike Pompeo and Benjamin Netanyahu there. And Owen, tell us, what are some of the other reactions we're hearing coming out of Israel?
Well, listen, the politicians are thrilled, as you might expect. Although, Sarah, in the back of their minds, I wonder if some of them aren't so thrilled because, as we were just saying a second ago, this is a move that helps their political rival, that helps the man they're running against, whether they're in the parties on the political right who are jostling for votes with Prime Minister Netanyahu among those right-wing voters, or whether they're those challengers on the left who want to see the right-wing bloc somehow lose a parliament seat or two to be able to have the center-left somehow come to power, at least share power again. But the politicians coming out and saying what they know the voters want to hear, that they're excited about this and they're happy with it. We should say Naftali Bennett of the New Right Party has come out and said it's a good step, but it shouldn't be in exchange for Israeli concessions on other issues and trying to go up against Prime Minister Netanyahu from the right on the issues connected to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to say that they should warning Prime Minister Netanyahu not to make concessions on that and challenging him to commit himself already now not to do that in the future. As for international reactions, Russia coming out against this move, an interesting step, of course, but Russia, again, a strong ally of Syrian President Bashar Assad, and, of course, wants to stand up against the United States. Sarah, coming out and saying that they're against this move certainly serves Russia's interests, again, helps build Russia's soft power in the Arab world and far beyond it as a country that opposes the United States. But on the other hand, I wonder in the back of their minds if the Russians aren't at least a little bit satisfied with this. Again, Russia's game plan internationally is to try to chip away at the liberal international order, as it's called, those set of rules that have held and governed the world since World War II. One of the most important of those rules is the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. Sarah, that means that you can't go into another country and take part of it and make it your own. That, you could argue, is what the United States is saying Israel can legitimately do here. That's different from saying that Israel is allowed to be present in the Golan Heights on a temporary or even long-term temporary basis, as the Golan Heights is at least technically under occupation. But it's very, very different to actually recognize formally, as the Trump administration certainly seems to be doing, that this isn't an occupation, that this is legitimately and permanently part of the state of Israel. That's a precedent Russia could potentially point to in its own foreign policies in places like Crimea or other steps the Russians might take in the future. But if that's the way the Russians are feeling, they have no interest in telling us about that. They have every interest in going out there before the cameras and in their written statements to come out against the United States, really burnishes their reputation. As for the Europeans, they're up to their necks in Brexit right now in their summit. And again, when they come up for air, I suspect we'll hear them condemn it as well, and China and other countries, and of course the Arab world.
Okay, Senior International Affairs Correspondent Owen Altman, thank you so much. And US President Donald Trump is set to speak shortly in Washington. We are seeing live images coming in now, and we will, of course, take you live to that when it happens. But for now, that is all we have time for. I'm Sarah Coates. Thanks for watching.